The Tonight Show. November 14, 1976. Audrey Hepburn was already seated when she did something nobody had done in 14 years of the show's history. She reached across the desk. She took Johnny Carson's hand. And then she said absolutely nothing. For 90 seconds, the most celebrated actress alive held the hand of the most watched man on television, and neither of them spoke a single word. The audience did not breathe. The orchestra did not play. The cameras kept rolling because nobody in the control room gave the order to stop, and nobody gave that order because every person in that room understood, on some level they could not explain, that what was happening was too important to interrupt. And what finally broke that silence, the first words Audrey Hepburn spoke after 90 seconds of live national television silence, made everyone in that studio understand something about grief that they had never understood before. About survival. About the things we carry alone for decades because we tell ourselves the world is not ready to hear them. But before we go any further, I have to tell you something that changes everything you are about to witness. Because the real story did not begin on that stage. It did not begin that night. It began 31 years earlier, in a small Dutch town during the coldest winter in recorded European history. And it began with a woman whose name Audrey Hepburn had never spoken on camera, not once, in over 2 decades of interviews, of profiles, of magazine covers.
Before we continue our video, I'd like to say something. I often see comments from people who didn't realize they weren't subscribed. If you enjoy the channel, please take a second to check and make sure you're subscribed. It's free, and it really helps us keep the show growing. Thank you for being part of this journey with us.
Of the kind of relentless public scrutiny that strips most people bare. A name she had guarded like something sacred. And the reason she finally said it that night, in front of 22 million people, on live television, holding a stranger's hand, is the reason this story has never left the people who witnessed it. But first, you need to know what happened 6 hours before Audrey Hepburn walked onto that stage. Because what happened at 5:17 in the afternoon in an NBC green room is what made everything else possible. And when you hear it, you will understand that 90 seconds of silence was not a pause. It was 30 years of something finally finding a way out. November 14, 1976. 5:17 in the afternoon. NBC Studios, Burbank. The green room on the second floor of Studio One was quiet. Audrey Hepburn sat in a chair by the window, still in her street clothes, a glass of water untouched on the table beside her. She had arrived an hour early. The makeup artist had come and gone twice, both times turned away gently at the door. The wardrobe assistant had laid out the outfit, a cream-colored blouse, tailored dark trousers, pearl earrings, a combination so quietly perfect it looked effortless, which of course meant it had taken weeks to plan. But Audrey had not looked at it. She was holding a piece of paper. Not a script, not notes, for the interview. A single handwritten page, thin and slightly translucent, the kind of paper that comes from overseas, from somewhere that still uses airmail. And she had been holding it for 4 hours. The green room assistant, a 24-year-old woman named Patricia Harlow who had worked at The Tonight Show for 8 months, knocked twice and entered with a tray of coffee. She would later tell colleagues that she almost left immediately, because something about the room felt wrong. Not dangerous. Not alarming. Just wrong, the way a room feels after someone has been crying in it for a very long time. Audrey looked up. She smiled. And Patricia said, in 30 years of working in television, she never forgot that smile. Because it was the saddest smile she had ever seen on a face that the whole world called beautiful. "Is there anything you need, Miss Hepburn?" Patricia asked. Audrey looked at the piece of paper in her hands. Then she looked at the window. Then back at Patricia. She said, very quietly, "I received some news today. I'm trying to decide if I should go home." Patricia did not know what to say. She set the coffee down and left. She walked directly to the producer's office. And that was how, 20 minutes later, Johnny Carson came to knock on Audrey Hepburn's green room door. Wait. Because what happened behind that door is the part of this story nobody has ever told completely. And it is the part that explains everything you are about to see on that stage. Everything. Johnny Carson had been hosting The Tonight Show since 1962. In 14 years, he had interviewed presidents and poets and rock stars and scientists and criminals and comedians and every variation of human being the 20th century had produced. He had, by every professional measurement, seen everything. He was not easily moved. He was not easily surprised. He was a man who had built an empire on the ability to remain precisely calibrated in any situation, to be warm without being vulnerable, interested without being invested, present without being exposed. It was the architecture of his genius and, as anyone who knew him well understood, also the architecture of his loneliness. But when he knocked on that green room door and Audrey Hepburn said, "Come in," and he opened the door and saw her sitting there with that piece of paper and that untouched glass of water and that expression, something shifted in him that he would not fully understand until much later. He sat down across from her. He did not ask about the show. He did not ask about the interview. He did not ask about Robin and Marion or Sean Connery or any of the safe, professional topics that were supposed to anchor the broadcast in 3 hours. He looked at her and said simply, "Are you all right?" And Audrey Hepburn, who had not cried all day, who had held herself together with the discipline of a woman who learned as a child that falling apart was a luxury she could not afford, looked at Johnny Carson and said, "I don't know. I'm not sure I am." They talked for 40 minutes. The stage manager knocked 3 times. Each time, Johnny said through the door, "Give us a few more minutes." Nobody on the crew had ever heard Johnny Carson request more time before a broadcast. Not once. Not in 14 years. When they finally emerged, Audrey's eyes were composed, but her posture was different. Slightly softer. As though she had set something down that she had been carrying at shoulder height for a very long time. Johnny's face was unreadable in the way it was always unreadable. But the show's director, a man who had been watching Johnny's face on monitors for 11 years, said afterward that he saw an expression he did not recognize. Not professional warmth. Not performance. Something quieter. Something that looked, he would say years later, like reverence. What you have seen so far is nothing compared to what was about to happen on that stage. Because what those 40 minutes in the green room produced was not a plan. It was not a prepared segment. It was something far more dangerous than either of those things. It was permission. What nobody on that crew could have known was what Audrey Hepburn had told Johnny Carson in those 40 minutes. She told him about the winter of 1944, which the Dutch call the Hunger Winter. The Hunger Winter. The winter when the Nazi occupation cut off food supplies to the Western Netherlands and 22,000 civilians died of starvation in 4 months. She was 10 years old when it began. 11 when it ended. In between, she ate sugar beets, grass, tulip bulbs stripped of their outer skin and boiled in water that turned the color of rust. She told him she had weighed 88 pounds by the time spring arrived. She told him she watched neighbors who had been large, healthy people become something else entirely. She told him there were mornings when she woke up and was not certain her mother was still alive in the next room. She said all of this in a green room in Burbank, California, 32 years later, and she said it not with the detached fluency of someone reciting a prepared speech but with the careful, particular weight of someone who has never said these exact words in this exact order to another person and is discovering, in real time, as she says them, what they still cost. The show began on schedule. Johnny's monologue was sharp, assured, perfectly timed. He was in his element, and the audience adored him for it. But Ed McMahon, 16 years into knowing exactly how Johnny's body moved in that chair, could see that something was different. His right hand rested too still on the desk. His eyes moved toward the wings twice between jokes. The drumroll, the laughter, the rhythm of the show, all of it played out exactly as it always did. And underneath it, something was coiled. Something was waiting. At 11:47, Ed McMahon's voice filled the studio. "Ladies and gentlemen, 4-time Academy Award nominee, Oscar winner, Tony winner, Emmy winner, the woman Hubert de Givenchy called his only true muse, the woman Truman Capote insisted was the only real Holly-Golightly he ever met. Please welcome Audrey Hepburn. The audience rose before she appeared. She came through the curtain in the cream blouse and the dark trousers and the pearl earrings, and the room responded the way rooms always responded to Audrey Hepburn. With something that was not quite applause and not quite silence, but something between the two, the involuntary hush that descends when something is so completely and precisely itself that the first instinct is not to react but simply to look. She moved to the desk. She shook Johnny's hand. She sat down. She crossed her legs. She looked at the audience with a smile so warm, so controlled, so complete that 22 million people watching at home had no idea, not the faintest idea, what was waiting beneath it. For the first 12 minutes, the interview was exactly what it was supposed to be. She was gracious about Robin and Marion. She was funny about filming in Spain. She spoke about stepping away from Hollywood with the kind of calm certainty that made everything she said sound like it had always been true. The audience was enchanted. Johnny was at ease. The show was running exactly on schedule. And then Johnny Carson did something that was not on his note cards. Do not miss this. Because what Johnny Carson asked at the 12-minute mark came directly from the 40 minutes he had spent in that green room, listening to a woman describe something she had never told another person. He leaned slightly forward. His voice changed just enough that the people who knew him best, Ed, the director, the floor manager, all of them noticed it simultaneously. He said, "Audrey, you've talked about your childhood before, about Holland during the war, but always in that careful way. The way people talk about something when they're deciding how much of it is safe to say. I want to ask you something different tonight." He paused for exactly 1 second. "Who kept you safe?" The studio went completely quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of an audience waiting for a punchline. Something else. The question had weight. It had history. 3 words that landed like 3 separate stones on still water. Who kept you safe? Audrey looked at Johnny. And for one moment, just one, her face changed. The controls slipped, not completely, not visibly to the camera operators or the audience, but Johnny saw it. He had spent 40 minutes learning where to look. Audrey's right hand, which had been resting loosely in her lap, moved to the edge of the desk. And then, very slowly, she reached across. She placed her hand over Johnny's. And she did not speak. 90 seconds. On live national television, with 22 million Americans watching from their living rooms, Audrey Hepburn held Johnny Carson's hand and said nothing. The orchestra did not play. Ed McMahon sat motionless. The floor manager looked at the director. The director looked at his assistant. Nobody said a word. Nobody cut to commercial. Nobody intervened. Because something was happening on that stage that television had never held before, and every person in that control room understood that the worst thing they could do, the single most catastrophic mistake available to them, was to interrupt it. A camera operator named Gil Reyes, who had worked the Tonight Show desk camera for 9 years, said later that he had never made a decision so purely on instinct in his entire career. He slowly pushed in. Not to Johnny. To Audrey's face. And what he found in the viewfinder was something he described for the rest of his life as the most honest thing he ever put on film. Because Audrey Hepburn's face in those 90 seconds was doing something it almost never did in public. It was remembering. You could see it. The specific, private weight of a memory that has been carried so long it has changed the shape of the person carrying it. The way old grief settles into a person like sediment, not gone, just low and slow and permanently altered from what it was when it first arrived. In the control room, the show's associate producer, a man named Gerald Sachs who had worked in television for 22 years, said he watched the monitor and realized he had stopped breathing. He became aware of it only when he needed to inhale, and found that his lungs had simply been waiting. He said afterward that in 2 decades of live television he had experienced every variety of silence. Dead air. Technical failure. A guest who forgot their line. An answer that went somewhere nobody anticipated. But this was not any of those things. This was not absence. This was the opposite of absence. This was a silence so full it had weight and pressure and temperature. This was the silence of 31 years and a dead woman's name and a child who had eaten tulip bulbs and grown up to become the most photographed woman of her generation. And every person in that control room, without speaking to one another, without any signal or direction, understood the same thing at the same moment. You do not interrupt this. You do not cut away from this. You let it breathe until it is ready to become something else. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. Barely, but steady. There was a woman, Audrey said. Her name was Mevrouw Korstjes. She lived in Arnhem. During the occupation, when my family had nothing, when we were eating tulip bulbs because there was nothing else left, she came to our door. Audrey paused. She looked at Johnny's hand, which was now holding hers back. I was 11 years old. She saved us. She shared what she had when she had almost nothing herself. She lied to officers about who was inside our house. She stood in a doorway in 1944 and looked a German soldier in the face, and she lied for us. And she was not exceptional. She was not famous. She was not remarkable in any way that the world keeps records of. She was just a woman who decided that the right thing to do was worth the cost of doing it. Audrey stopped. She took one breath. The studio was so quiet you could hear the ventilation system above the stage ceiling. This morning, she said, I was told that she died. Yesterday. In her home. At 81 years old. And I have spent 30 years meaning to go back and tell her, publicly, on some stage large enough to matter, that she saved my life. And I never went back. And now she is gone. And the only thing I can think to do, the only thing that feels like it still has any meaning, is to say her name. Here. Where people can hear it. Mevrouw Korstjes. Of Arnhem. Who fed a hungry child and lied to the people who would have killed her for it. Her voice did not break. But it cost her something not to let it. What happened next was the moment every person in that studio carried with them for the rest of their lives. Johnny Carson reached across with his other hand. He took both of Audrey's hands in both of his. He looked at her directly, not at the camera, not at the audience, at her. He said nothing for a moment. And then, quietly, just audible through the microphones, he said, She knows. Wherever she is. She has always known. Audrey closed her eyes. She nodded once. And the studio, 300 people, applauded. Not the thunderous applause of entertainment. The soft, sustained applause that has only one meaning. We heard you. We witnessed this. We will not forget. But what nobody in that studio knew yet was that the story was not over. Because what Audrey said next was something she had never told anyone. Not to a journalist. Not to a director. Not to a husband. Not to her closest friends. Something she had carried since she was 11 years old, and had never once spoken aloud to another living person. She looked at Johnny. She said, I have a question that I have never asked out loud. And I don't know if this is the right place to ask it, but I don't know if I will ever have a better one. Can I ask you something strange? Of course, Johnny said. She looked at the camera. Not at the audience. At the camera itself. At the 22 million people on the other side of it. She said, Do you think the people who save us know? Do you think they understand what they did? Or do they just wake up every morning and go on living without knowing that they are the reason someone else is still here? The studio was completely still. She turned back to Johnny. Because I have thought about this my entire life. I became an actress. I won awards. I worked with the greatest directors and wore the most beautiful clothes and had my photograph taken more times than I can count. And none of it, not one single moment of it, would exist without a woman who stood in a doorway in 1944 and made a choice. And she never knew. She never knew what she started. How do we live with that? The number of people we sustain without knowing we are sustaining them? Johnny Carson was quiet for a moment. He was looking at their joined hands. Then he looked at her. He said, I think that's the most important question anyone has ever asked on this show. And I think the answer is that we can't know. We cannot know who we're keeping alive just by showing up. Just by being decent. Just by standing in a doorway. He paused. So we have to act as though every single person we encounter might be someone we are sustaining without knowing it. Because some of them are. She squeezed his hands. Some of them are, she repeated quietly. They sat together for another 20 minutes before either of them moved. Audrey spoke about her father. She had not spoken about him this way in any interview. He had left when she was 6 years old, had embraced ideologies that placed her family in danger, had chosen a side in a war that made his own daughter's survival uncertain. She told Johnny that for most of her life she had understood her career, the discipline, the elegance, the absolute refusal to ever appear less than composed in public, as a response to that abandonment. If she was perfect enough, perhaps the world would not leave. If she was gracious enough, beautiful enough, measured enough, perhaps she could earn back the safety her father had taken with him when he walked out the door. Johnny listened without speaking. He did not offer a parallel experience. He did not reach for the professional empathy that had made him a legend. He simply listened the way a person listens when they understand that the most valuable thing they can offer in that particular moment is the complete absence of interruption. When Audrey finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at him. I don't know why I told you all of that, she said. I've never said it on camera before. I've never said it anywhere. Johnny looked at her steadily. Maybe that's exactly why you needed to, he said. She considered this for a long moment. She nodded slowly. Then she said something that the floor manager, standing just out of frame, would repeat in interviews for the rest of his career. She said, I think I came here tonight to say her name. But I think I also came here to say mine. Johnny did not respond immediately. He held her hands a moment longer. Then he said quietly, I think you just did both. The segment ran 34 minutes past its scheduled time. No one from the network called to cut it. The switchboard at NBC received 1,100 calls in the hour following broadcast, every line simultaneously occupied for the first time in the building's history. Letters arrived over the following 3 weeks in volumes the Tonight Show mailroom had never processed. Not from fans of Audrey Hepburn, not specifically. From people who had their own Mevro Courses. From people who had spent years meaning to go back. People who had not gone back in time. People who sat at a desk or a kitchen table reading those letters and decided, that night, that it was not too late to make the call they had been postponing. An organization in Amsterdam received a substantial anonymous donation the following morning, enough to fund a small memorial in Arnhem dedicated to the ordinary people who made extraordinary choices during the occupation. The administrator who processed it called Audrey's assistant to confirm the amount. She thought there had been an error. There was no error. What happened to Audrey Hepburn in the years following that broadcast was described by the people who knew her best not as a transformation, because Audrey was always entirely herself, always precisely and completely herself, but as a release. As though she had been carrying a particular weight so long she had stopped noticing its presence, and then someone had lifted it, and for the first time in 30 years she stood differently. Her first husband, Mel Ferrer, saw her at a function 6 months after the broadcast. He said she looked younger than she had in years. Not physically. In the sense of someone who is no longer paying the cost of a secret carried too long. She became a UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador in 1988. She spent the last years of her life traveling to places where cameras rarely followed, where children were hungry in precisely the way she had once been hungry, where she could look into a face and understand it from the inside rather than the outside. People who traveled with her on those missions said the same thing, independently and consistently. She never looked at a suffering child as a subject. She looked at them as someone she recognized. Someone she had been. And she held their hands with the same quietness she had used on a television stage in 1976. The same quality of attention. The same absolute refusal to look away. In 1992, on a UNICEF mission to Somalia, a photojournalist named James Naktwi, who traveled alongside her that week, said he watched her sit with a group of children in a feeding station outside Mogadishu. She stayed for 4 hours. Nobody asked her to stay that long. At some point she took one child's hand, a boy of about 8, and held it without speaking. She did not try to do anything except be present. James said he thought of something that afternoon but could not name it. Only later, when he saw footage of the Tonight Show broadcast on a tape a colleague had brought from the States, did he understand what he had witnessed. He recognized the gesture. He recognized the quality of the silence. He recognized the things she was doing with her hands and her attention and her willingness to simply stay. He called his editor that night and said, "She has been practicing that since 1976. Maybe longer. Maybe all her life." She was asked in a 1989 interview what she considered the most important moment of her career. The interviewer expected Roman holiday. Breakfast at Tiffany's. The dress. The cigarette holder. The image that had defined a generation. Audrey was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The night I said her name." When a reporter asked for elaboration, she wrote back. Brief. Precise. Completely herself. She said, "I have been in films that millions of people have seen. I have worn clothes that changed the way women thought about beauty. I have been photographed until photography became the air I breathed. But the most important thing I ever did on a stage was say the name of a woman who stood in a doorway in 1944. Everything else I have done is an attempt to be worthy of what she made possible." Audrey Hepburn passed away on January 20, 1993. She was 63 years old. Among the tributes from every corner of the world, one stood apart. It came from a small town in the Netherlands. A handwritten note. Signed by 7 members of a family. The grandchildren of Mevrouw Korsjes. It said simply, "We watched the broadcast. We had no idea. Thank you for saying her name." Johnny Carson read the note on air. He did not explain immediately where it came from. He just read it. And then he sat for a moment holding it. And then he looked at the camera. And he said, "That's what the whole thing is for. All of it. The lights. The cameras. The decades of trying to make something worth watching. It's for this. For the moment when the right person finally says the right name in a room large enough for the right people to hear it." He folded the note. He placed it in his jacket pocket. He went to commercial. And when the cameras came back, he was composed. Completely and entirely composed. Because he was Johnny Carson, and that was what Johnny Carson did. But the stage manager, a woman who had worked beside him for 11 years, said she saw him in the hallway before the next segment. His eyes were wet. He was looking at nothing in particular. And he was smiling. There is a question Audrey Hepburn asked on live television in 1976 that has never stopped asking itself. Do the people who save us know what they did? Do they understand the size of what happened when they simply chose to be decent? The only answer anyone has ever given is the one Johnny Carson gave across a desk with joined hands and complete silence. We cannot know who we are keeping alive. We can only act as though every person we are decent to might be someone we are sustaining without knowing it. Because some of them are. You are watching this right now because someone, somewhere, in a moment you may or may not remember, made a choice that kept you here. Maybe they know it. Almost certainly they don't. This is your stage. Say their name. Share this with the person who kept you going without knowing it. Subscribe so we can keep telling the stories that matter. And drop a comment with a name. Someone who stood in a doorway for you. Because Mevrouw Korsjes deserved to have her name said out loud. And so does yours.